August 7, 1942. The Solomon Islands. A few minutes after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, somewhere between rabble and the chaos of an amphibious landing nobody on the Japanese side had been warned about. 18 Mitsubishi Zeros from the Tainan Air Group reached the airspace over the southern coast of Guadalcanal and looked down on a sight that was supposed to be impossible. American transport ships, American destroyers, American Marines on the beach. The first opposed amphibious landing the United States had ever conducted in the Pacific War, and it had taken the Imperial Navy completely by surprise. Among the 18 pilots in those Zeros was a wiry, soft-spoken man with a samurai bloodline 1,000 years old named Saburo Sakai. He held the rank of Petty Officer First Class, which meant in the rigidly stratified world of the Imperial Japanese Navy that he was a senior enlisted aviator with no commission, no academy ring, and a flight log thick enough to make most of the academy officers in his unit look like beginners. He had been flying combat since the war in China. He had killed pilots over Clarkfield, over Java, over Port Moresby. He flew his Zero with a tail code V107 and later V173 that Allied recognition officers had begun circling on debrief charts because the man flying it never seemed to lose. Above him in the formation flew Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Naijima, the Tainan Air Group's flying officer, the senior airborne combat leader of one of the most decorated fighter units in the Imperial Navy. He was not the unit's commanding officer. That was Captain Masahisa Saito, who stayed with the ground echelon at Rabble. Nakajima was the man who actually led the squadron in the air. The Hikotai, the one his pilots looked to in the seconds before contact. What happened in the next 48 hours over the Solomons would change something in the Imperial Japanese Navy that would never be put right again. It started slowly. The first American fighters Nakajima's pilots tangled with on the 7th, the F-4F Wildcats off the carrier Saratoga, fought the way the Japanese expected American pilots to fight. They came in fast, took a snapshot, dove away. Sakai himself shot down a Wildcat that morning. An aircraft flown by a United States Navy pilot named Lieutenant James Pug Southerntherland of Fighting Squadron 5 in a long tumbling 20-minute dogfight that has been one of the most carefully reconstructed individual air engagements of the entire Pacific War. Southerntherland was a Naval Academy graduate, class of 1936, and would end the war as a 5-victory ace himself. He had already shot down 2 Japanese bombers that morning when his Wildcat's guns jammed, probably from damage taken on the bomber attacks. He kept fighting anyway. He could not fire, but he could fly, and he kept turning inside the Zeros that came at him. Sakai, watching from above, dove in to join the dogfight, not realizing that Sutherland's guns were no longer working. The 2 pilots traded turns and dives for what Sakai later described in his memoir as the longest, hardest dogfight of his career. Neither man able to gain a clean firing solution. Sakai was astonished at how much punishment the Wildcat could absorb. He fired more than 200 rounds into Southerntherland's aircraft before he finally landed a 20mm cannon shell below the left-wing route and brought the airplane down. Southerntherland bailed out of his blazing Wildcat into the jungle below, suffering 11 wounds. He was found by Solomon Islanders who hid him from Japanese patrols, treated him, and helped him reach the coast. He was evacuated from Henderson Field on the 20th of August. Sakai went home with another tally on his canopy and the uneasy feeling that he had just met a different kind of American pilot than the ones he had been killing in the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. But somewhere in those skies on the 7th and the days that followed, the Wildcats started doing something different. Something Sakai's commander had never seen before. Nakajima saw it first. He came home from one mission and walked across the dusty coral strip at Rabble, and he could not for some minutes find the words for what he wanted to say. He had been the hunter. He had picked his target, slid into firing position behind a Wildcat, and a second Wildcat that had no business being where it was had come at him from the side hidden, guns lit. He had never seen it coming until it was almost too late to break off. He dove, ran, and survived. Sakai watched him land, watched him climb down off the wing, watched the way his hand shook on the cockpit ladder, and understood that something fundamental had just changed. Sakai wrote about it later in a memoir. His American interviewer Martin Caden would translate for the world. The pilots in the barracks at Rabaul that week, he said, asked the same question of each other in different ways. Who had taught the Americans to fight like this? The Americans, the elite of the Imperial Naval Air Service, all agreed were not naturally gifted dogfighters. They flew an inferior airplane. They were not particularly aggressive and close. And now suddenly, in the late summer of 1942, two of them together could defeat one of the best pilots in the Imperial Navy. Every single time, no matter how good he was, nobody in the barracks at Rabble had an answer for that question. By the time the Imperial Navy understood the answer, the men who could have done something about it would already be dead in the waters of Guadalcanal, of Santa Cruz, off the Philippine Sea. The question would no longer matter. There would be no one left who could fly a reply. The answer to the question was a man Nakajima had never heard of who had built the thing that was killing his pilots on the kitchen table of a rented house in Coronado, California, 9 months before the Tynan Air Group ever set up shop at Rabble. His name was John Smith Thatch. His friends called him Jimmy. And the story of what he did with a box of matchsticks in the summer of 1941 is one of the strangest and most consequential acts of pre-war military thinking the United States Navy ever produced. Before we get to him, we have to understand what he was working against. By every conventional measure of the early 1940s, the Japanese were the better fighter pilots in the Pacific. They had been the better fighter pilots since the air war over China in the late 1930s. They were flying a better airplane. They were the apex predators of carrier aviation, and in the first 6 months of the Pacific War, they proved it from Hawaii to Sun. The Imperial Navy had built this advantage on a deliberate choice made in the late 1920s. Quality over quantity. Beginning in 1930, the Navy launched the Yokorin program, the Flight Reserve Trainee Program, which took young Japanese boys aged 15 to 17 and put them through one of the most rigorous flight training pipelines in the world. The selection was savage. In 1937, when 500 sailors applied for the equivalent program for non-commissioned officers, 70 were accepted and 25 graduated. Sakai himself was one of those 25. He had earned a silver watch presented to him by Emperor Hirohito for graduating first in his class at Suchi. He had been one of the top fighter pilots in the empire by the time he was 23 years old. Men like Sakai trained constantly. They drilled in deflection shooting until they could put a burst into a target the size of a dinner plate from 300 m. They learned to land on a pitching carrier deck in heavy weather, to read the surface wind off the ocean from 5,000 feet up, to fly at night without instruments. The doctrine they were taught held that the dog fight was at heart a duel between samurai. The pilot who flew best, who saw first, who shot truest, won. The pilot who did not, lost. There was no other category. The aircraft they were given matched the doctrine. The Mitsubishi A6M Type 0, designed under Chief Engineer Jiro Horikoshi and entering service in 1940, was a machine built around a single principle. It would outturn anything in the sky. To achieve this, the Mitsubishi designers stripped weight from the airframe with a fanaticism that bordered on religious. They removed the armor plate behind the pilot's seat. They removed the self-sealing rubber lining from the fuel tanks. They thinned the wing skin. They used a magnesium-aluminum alloy so light and so brittle that a Zero could be punched into pieces by hits that a heavier American fighter would absorb without complaint. In exchange for this fragility, they got an aircraft that could climb at over 3,000 feet per minute, turn inside any Allied fighter then in service, and engage at ranges no other carrier fighter in the world could match. The Zero could fly a combat radius of more than 500 nautical miles, a figure that made Allied planners refuse to believe their own intelligence reports when they first saw it. The result, when this aircraft and these men met the Allied air forces in December of 1941, was carnage. The Pearl Harbor Strike Force comprised roughly 770 air crew, of whom a small fraction were lost. In the Philippines, in Malaya, in the Dutch East Indies, in the Great Indian Ocean raid that drove the Royal Navy out of Southeast Asia, Zeros tore through Brewster Buffaloes and Curtiss Warhawks and Hawker Hurricanes with a kill ratio that approached 12 to 1. By April of 1942, an Allied pilot who attempted to dogfight a Zero was understood in every Air Force flying against the Japanese to be a dead man. Standing orders in some American squadrons specifically forbade pilots from turning with a Zero under any circumstances. The recommended counter was to dive, run, and hope for clouds. This was the world that John Smith Th was looking at in the spring of 1941 when 6 months before Pearl Harbor, he was given command of Fighting Squadron 3, at Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego. He had just turned 36. He went by Jimmy because an older brother named James had been at the Naval Academy ahead of him, and the upperclassman had hung the nickname on him before he could shake it. He was tall, lanky, soft-spoken, with a slow Arkansas draw. He was not, by the standards of the pre-war Navy, a brilliant officer in the way the term was usually meant. He had not topped his class at Annapolis. He had not made his name with daring stunts. What he had was a quality that was quieter and harder to see. He thought about problems all the way down until they came apart in his hands. In September of 1941, a document landed on his desk that would change everything. The Fleet Air Tactical Unit Intelligence Bulletin of September 22 contained a description of the Mitsubishi Zero, pieced together from observations by the American Volunteer Group, the Flying Tigers, who were already flying combat against Japanese aircraft over China. The bulletin reported a fighter that climbed at more than 5,000 feet per minute, turned inside any American fighter known to exist, and operated at ranges the Wildcat could not match. The actual climb rate of the Zero was closer to 3,100 feet per minute, but the bulletin overstated it. Either way, the picture it painted was bleak. Thatch read the numbers and understood what they meant. The airplane he and his pilots were flying was about to be sent against an enemy aircraft they could not turn with, could not climb with, and could not run from. He took the bulletin home with him to the rented house in Coronado where he and his wife Meline were living. He read it again. He read it a third time. The Wildcat was tougher. Yes, it had armor and self-sealing tanks and a punishing armament of 650 caliber Browning machine guns. But none of that mattered if the Zero could choose when and where to fight. According to his own oral history given years later to the United States Naval Institute, Thatch sat down at his kitchen table that night with a box of ordinary matchsticks and began to play. The matchsticks were aircraft. The patterns on the wood grain were dog fights. He moved them across the table, watching how each formation could and could not respond to attack from each angle. He did this every night for weeks. Tactic at midnight, flight test the next morning over San Diego Bay, debrief that evening, rearrange the matchsticks, try again. The first thing he discovered was that the standard American three-plane formation, two wingmen flanking a leader, was hopeless against a faster opponent. The wingmen spent so much energy maintaining position that they could not look behind them. They were prisoners of their own geometry. He decided the basic tactical unit had to be a pair, two aircraft side by side, watching each other's tails rather than each other's wings. The United States Navy formally adopted the two-plane section as its basic fighter element in July of 1941, partly on his recommendation. That change alone would have improved American fighter performance even without anything else. But the pair alone was not enough. Two Wildcats, no matter how alert, could not survive an engagement with a faster, more maneuverable enemy who could choose his moment, attack, miss, and disengage upward at will. Thatch kept moving the matchsticks. The answer was two pairs. For aircraft flying abreast separated by a distance roughly equal to the turning radius of a Wildcat. The Zero attacks one pair. The other pair watching immediately turns toward the pair under attack. The pair under attack turns toward the rescuers. The two pairs cross paths. The Zero focused on the bait suddenly finds itself looking down the gun barrels of the second pair, which is now flying straight at it head-on. If the Zero presses its attack, it dies. If it breaks off, the rescuers swing around onto its tail. There is no third option. The trap was geometric. It did not depend on individual brilliance, on superior gunnery, on the airplane being equal to the Zero. It depended only on two pairs of pilots executing a simple turn at the right moment. Anyone could be trained to do it. That was the genius of it. Thack called the maneuver the beam defense position because the second pair came in from the side from the beam of the attacker. He used that name in his official correspondence. The pilots in his squadron called it something simpler within weeks. They called it the weave because that was what it looked like from the air. Two pairs of fighters weaving in and out across each other's flight paths like threads in a loom. The name that would stick, the Thack Weave, was given to it the following year by his close friend and Lieutenant Commander James Flatley. He knew before he tested it in the air that something this strange had to be proven. So in the autumn of 1941, he set up an experiment that has become legendary in the history of American naval aviation. He called on his second section leader, a young Irish-American ensign named Edward Henry Butch O'Hare, who would within months become the Navy's first ace of the Pacific War and the first naval aviator to receive the Medal of Honor in World War II. O'Hare was 27 years old, the son of a Chicago lawyer with a complicated past, a graduate of Annapolis class of 1937, and one of the most naturally gifted pilots VF-3 had. Thach had picked him as second section leader because he wanted his sharpest aviator playing the attacker. The point was to see whether the weave could survive against the best. Thach explained what he wanted. O'Hare would lead a flight of Wildauts playing the role of attackers flying at full power. Thach himself would lead a flight playing the role of defenders, flying the beam defense position with their throttles wired down to half power, simulating the performance handicap of fighting a faster Japanese opponent. The throttle wires were a small detail with large consequences. They locked the defenders' engines at half their available output, which meant the defenders could not simply outrun their problems. They had to solve them with geometry alone. They went up over San Diego Bay. O'Hare attacked from above. He attacked from astern. He attacked from every angle and altitude he could think of. Every single time with their throttles wired to half their available power, Thach's defenders either ruined his attack or maneuvered into position to shoot back. After they landed and taxied back to the line, O'Hare climbed out of his cockpit, walked over to Thach with his flight helmet still on, and said the words that became the founding scripture of American carrier fighter doctrine. "Skipper," he said, "it really worked. I couldn't make any attack without seeing the nose of one of your airplanes pointed at me. That had done it on a kitchen table with matchsticks months before he would ever see a zero in the air." The question now was whether the maneuver would survive contact with the actual aircraft and the actual men he had designed it to defeat. The answer would come in June of 1942 in the deepest and most consequential carrier engagement of the Pacific War midway. The morning of June 4, 1942, the American carrier Yorktown launched its strike group around 8:40 in the morning. 6 F-4F Wildcats of Fighting Squadron 3, led by Jimmy Tharch himself, were the only fighter escort for 12 Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers of Torpedo 3 with Dauntless dive bombers of Bombing 3 following. 6 fighters to cover an entire torpedo squadron and an entire dive bomber squadron against the most dangerous fighter air arm in the world. Thach had to revise his formation in the air because 6 aircraft was not divisible into 2 pairs of 2 pairs. He took Enan Robert Allen Murray Dibb, called Ram by everyone in the squadron, as his wingman. Dibb had only joined VF-3 a few weeks earlier. He was 21 years old, a recent graduate, untested in combat, and his familiarity with the weave consisted of one rushed practice session with Thark a few days before. Thach paired Lieutenant Junior Grade Brainerd Tucker Macoma on loan from VF-42 with Enan Edgar Bassett, also from 42. Macoma's radio was out, and he had never been formally trained in the weave, a fact that would matter in the next half hour. The remaining 2 Wildcats flown by machinist Tom Cheek and Enan Daniel Sheedy were detached as low cover for the slow torpedo planes. Approaching the Japanese fleet, the small American formation was bounced by Zeros of the Japanese Carrier Combat Air Patrol. Bassett's Wildcat was hit on the first pass, slanted toward the water, and burst into flames. He was killed. Macoma's Wildcat was stitched by fire as well, but stayed in the air. Thach found himself with 3 serviceable fighters against a Zero combat air patrol that the official Naval Aviation Museum count puts at between 15 and 20 aircraft over his immediate engagement. Macoma's silent radio meant Thach could not coordinate with him by voice. He had a few seconds to decide what to do. What he did is one of the most remarkable acts of small unit leadership in the history of fighter combat. He waved Dibb out wide to the right. He instructed Dibb by hand signals across the cockpit gap to act as a section leader. Then he ordered Macomber to follow Dibb. The Zeros pounced on Dibb almost immediately, exactly as Thach had wanted. Dibb radioed for help and turned hard back toward Thach. That turned into him. Macoma, not knowing what was happening, but doing what he was told, followed. Thach pulled his Wildcat under his wingman, lined up the underside of the pursuing Zero in his sights and squeezed. The .50 caliber rounds opened a line of holes from the engine cowling back along the fuselage. The Zero shed pieces of its cowling and burst into flame. Then he did it again and again. The Zero pilots, trained from their first day at Sukiura to think of the dogfight as a 1-against-1 duel, kept committing to the bait. Each time the second Wildcat was already pointed at them by the time they understood what was happening. A few Zeros tried to follow Dib through the weave instead of breaking off, and were shot down by Thatch as they passed in front of him. One Zero pilot attacking Maka made the mistake of failing to follow his target through the turn, slowed up to correct his aim, and was killed by Thatch in passing. By the time the Japanese broke contact, and the surviving Wildcats turned for the Yorktown, VF-3 had been credited with multiple confirmed Zero kills for the loss of Bassett. Thatch personally claimed 3. Dib claimed 1. Makoma, frustrated and breaking formation in the heat of it, claimed a probable Cheek, and Shady in the lower section, fighting their own separate engagement, accounted for at least one more Zero between them. 6 Wildcats outnumbered, outclassed, going up against the most feared fighter pilots in the Pacific, with one of their pilots dead in the first 30 seconds and another of their radios out. They had bloodied the Japanese Carrier Combat Air Patrol and walked away with 5 of their 6 surviving aircraft. Thatch himself, when he sat down in the Yorktown's ready room that evening to write his report, was modest to the point of self-deprecation. The truth, he wrote, was that any success against the Japanese Zero fighter was not due to the performance of the Wildcat, but to the comparatively poor marksmanship of the Japanese, the stupid mistakes made by a few of their pilots, and the superior marksmanship and teamwork of some of his own. He was understating it. The men around him had executed on a hand signal, with one of them having never trained in the maneuver, the tactic he had spent 6 months building on a kitchen table 8 months earlier. If the story stopped at Midway, the weave would be a curiosity in the memoirs of one squadron. What makes it a tactical revolution is what happened next. Within weeks, the maneuver had spread across the United States Navy and Marine Corps fighter community. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, who had been executive officer of VF-42 at Coral Sea and was now forming Fighting Squadron 10 on the carrier Enterprise, the Grim Reapers, picked it up and began drilling his pilots in it. He sent Thatch a personal note. "I am calling it the Thwavy for your information." Flatley used it himself at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October of 1942, when his division of 4 Wildcats was engaged by Zeros from the Japanese carrier Juno. One of the Japanese pilots, Lieutenant Yoshio, made several attack runs against Flatley's section, found himself looking down the guns of a second Wildcat each time, and finally gave up. Marine pilots flying off the rough coral airstrip at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Men who slept in tents and drank water out of cut-down oil drums and lived through the nightly bombardments of the Tokyo Express started using the weave against the Tainan Kokutai Zeros from Rabble. Henderson Field had been a Japanese airstrip until the Marines took it in the first days of the campaign and named it after Major Lofton Henderson, the Marine dive bomber leader killed at Midway. The pilots who flew the worn-out Wildcats off Henderson called themselves the Cactus Air Force after the radio code name for the airfield. They were chronically short of spare parts, fuel, and pilots. They were chronically outnumbered. By late 1942, every Wildcat squadron in the South Pacific had some version of the weave in its tactical playbook. Joe Foss, the Marine ace who would end the Guadalcanal campaign with 26 confirmed kills and a Medal of Honor, used variants of it. Even dauntless dive bomber crews adopted it on their return runs from carrier strikes, because 2 of them flying the weave gave their rear gunners clean shots at any Zero pursuing the other. The maneuver scaled. It worked between fighters. It worked between bombers. It worked between mixed flights. As long as 2 aircraft would commit to watching each other's tails, the geometry of the trap held. Which brings us back to Saburo Sakai. Back to the barracks at Rabble. Back to the question nobody could answer. The day after his commander, Tadashi Nakajima, first encountered the weave, Sakai himself encountered the limit of what a single Zero could do against American teamwork. On the 7th of August, late in the afternoon over the channel between Guadalcanal and Tulagi, he spotted a flight of 8 aircraft below him at about 7,800 feet. He took them for Wildcats. He dove. He picked the lead aircraft and lined up a deflection shot. He was wrong about what he was looking at. They were not Wilds. They were Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from a mixed flight of Bombing 5 and Bombing 6 off the carrier Enterprise. Each of them had a rear gunner with a fixed machine gun mount aimed straight back over the tail. The aircraft Sakai had picked was flown by Enan Robert C. War of Bombing 6. Its rear gunner was Aviation Ordnanceman Second Ass Harold L. Jones. Sakai opened fire. Jones returned it. A burst from the back seat shattered Sakai's canopy. A .30 caliber bullet creased his skull, blinded him in the right eye, and paralyzed the left side of his body. The Zero rolled inverted and started down toward the ocean. Sakai with one eye, partial paralysis, blood pooling in the cockpit, and no canopy pulled out of the dive. The cold air at altitude woke him up enough to think. He was 400 m from home with a head wound, and he chose not to die. He flew his 0560 nautical miles back to Rabble, navigating by the volcanic peaks he had memorized from earlier missions in a 4-hour and 47-minute flight that has no equal in the history of single-seat aviation. He nearly crashed into a line of parked Zeros on his approach. He circled the field 4 times with the fuel gauge reading empty. He landed on his second attempt and insisted on making his mission report to his superior officer before he would let the medics put him in a stretcher. His friend Hiroshi Nishiwa, the Tainan's top ace, physically removed the waiting driver and drove Sakai to the unit surgeon himself. Sakai survived. He lost most of the vision in his right eye permanently. He spent 5 months in Yokosuka Naval Hospital and then a year as a flight instructor watching teenage pilots wreck themselves on the takeoff roll because the Japanese training pipeline had been shortened to keep up with combat losses. Then, against medical advice, he talked his way back into combat in 1944 and flew Zeros over Yuma and the home islands until the war ended. He had been a petty officer first class on the day he was shot. He was promoted to warrant officer in November of 1943. He would not see the rank of Enin until late in the war. He was Japan's most famous ace in part because he was one of very few experienced naval fighter pilots from the early Pacific War who lived to tell the story. Most of them did not. And here we have to look closely at why the Imperial Japanese Navy never produced its own answer to the weave. The reason lies in 2 decisions made before the war began. The first was the decision to keep the pilot training program small, selective, and elite. In 1940, when the Imperial Navy was asked whether to expand pilot training in anticipation of a long conflict, the proposal was rejected. Japan, the planners reasoned, could not win a long war against the United States and therefore did not need to plan for one. The training pipeline would remain what it had always been. The men already in the cockpits would carry the war. The second was the decision when the war turned to keep the surviving veteran pilots on the front line until they died there. The United States Navy, by contrast, started rotating its experienced combat aviators home in 1942 and 1943 to instruct the next class of trainees. The Imperial Navy did not. Sakai's training cohort, the elite Yokorin and Soren graduates of the late 1930s, kept flying combat missions until they were shot down. By the end of the Guadalcanal campaign in February of 1943, the great majority of the experienced naval aviators who had attacked Pearl Harbor had been killed in action. The men who could read a fight, who knew when to commit and when to break off, who could spot the bait Wildcat offering itself, were dead in the water off Henderson Field, off Santa Cruz, off the Eastern Solomons. Their replacements, products of a compressed training program that had to push pilots through faster as losses mounted, did not have the experience to recognize a trap that a man like Nakajima had only recognized too late. Sakai himself, when he was finally pulled off operational duty after his head wound and assigned to train new pilots, wrote about the experience in 1943 with something close to despair. "We could not watch for individual errors," he said, "and take the long hours necessary to weed the faults out of a trainee." Hardly a day passed when fire engines and ambulances did not race down the runways, sirens shrieking to dig one or more pilots out of the plane he had wrecked on a clumsy takeoff or landing. We were told to rush men through, to forget the fine points, just teach them how to fly and shoot. The man who had once flown combat from China to New Guinea was now watching teenagers kill themselves on the takeoff roll and being ordered to send the survivors to the front. Anyway, while this was happening to the Japanese, the United States Navy was doing the opposite. In 1942 alone, the American Naval Aviation Training Program graduated almost 10,900 pilots, nearly twice as many as had completed the program in the entire previous 8 years combined. By 1943, the figure was almost 20,800. Each of these new aviators reached the fleet with around 500 hours of flight time. Replacement air groups were established starting in April of 1944 to put a final polish on pilots before they joined operational units. By contrast, by 1945, Japanese pilots were being certified for combat duty with less than 4 months of training and well under 100 hours in the air. The result was visible in the kill ratios. The F-4F Wildcat, the aircraft Thatch had designed the Weave to keep alive, ended the war with an air-to-air kill ratio of approximately 6.9 to 1. Its successor, the F-6F Hellcat, flying with the Weave already baked into its squadron's standard tactics, achieved a kill ratio against the Mitsubishi Zero of better than 13 to 1. By the time of the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, an engagement that the American pilots themselves nicknamed the Marianas Turkey Shoot, the Japanese were sending up barely trained teenagers in obsolete aircraft against American pilots who had memorized every weakness of the Zero from intelligence reports and captured airframes. The slaughter was so one-sided that some American pilots in their after-action reports expressed something close to embarrassment. The men who had built the most elite pilot training program in the world had been undone by their own perfectionism. They had refused to compromise on quality. The result was that they could not make enough of what they had. The Americans, who had compromised on individual virtuosity in favor of teamwork, mass production, and replaceability, had built a system that could absorb losses and keep generating pilots indefinitely. The Weave was the first crack in the dam. Everything else flowed through it. What Thatch had really done in his kitchen in Coronado, beyond inventing one specific tactic, was to prove a deeper proposition. He had proved that 2 airmen working together could defeat 1 ace working alone every time, no matter how good the ace was, no matter how superior his airplane, no matter how many years of training he had. He had taken an old principle, mutual support, and turned it into a piece of geometry that any reasonably competent fighter pilot could execute after one demonstration. He had made teamwork transferable. He had made it a thing you could teach a green in a single afternoon and trust him to perform in combat the next morning. That was what the matchsticks on the kitchen table had actually accomplished. The Imperial Japanese Navy never produced an equivalent piece of doctrine, partly because to do so would have required them to accept something about their own institution they could not bring themselves to accept. The Zero was built around the individual ace. The Yokorin program was built around the individual ace. Japanese fighter doctrine drilled into pilots from their first day at Sukiura was built around the individual ace. To beat the Weave, the Imperial Navy would have had to teach its pilots that no individual, no matter how skilled, could defeat 2 coordinated opponents, and that survival required flying as a team rather than as a cluster of duelists. They could not bring themselves to do it. They kept sending men up to die one at a time against opponents who had already decided to die in pairs. The verdict on the Pacific Air War, the honest one, is not that the Americans were better individual pilots than the Japanese. They were not. Pilot for pilot. In 1942, the Imperial Naval Air Service was probably the best fighter community in the world. The verdict is that the Americans had stumbled into a better system. A doctrine that did not depend on the exceptional individual married to a training pipeline that did not depend on the exceptional individual married to an industrial base that did not depend on the exceptional individual. The Weave was the moment when that system first proved its superiority over Japanese individual brilliance, and the Japanese never recovered the ground they lost in the months after Midway. The men who designed and first flew the Weave did not know they were rewriting how air combat would be fought for the next 80 years. They were trying to keep American pilots alive against an enemy whose airplane could outturn them and outclimb them and outrange them. They solved that immediate problem, and in solving it they accidentally solved a much larger one. The principles they had worked out. 2 aircraft watching each other's tails. The bait and the hook. The geometric trap for an attacker who commits to the wrong target are still taught today in every Western air combat training course. United States Navy F-4 Phantom crews used variations of the Weave against the MiG-17 over North Vietnam in the 1960s. American pilots flying F-15s and F-16s train on the same principles now. Most of the men who made it work do not have monuments. Edward Butch O'Hare did not live to see the war end. On the night of November 26, 1943, he was leading a section of 3 aircraft from the carrier Enterprise. 2 F-6F Hellcats flown by him, and Ensign Andy Scone, and a TBF Avenger flown by Lieutenant Commander Phil Phillips on what would have been one of the first nighttime fighter intercepts ever attempted from a United States carrier. They were trying to break up a Japanese torpedo bomber attack on the American task force. In the confusion of the night engagement, O'Hare's Hellcat went down. His body and aircraft were never recovered. He was 29 years old. The Chicago airport that bears his name was renamed for him in 1949. Most of the people who fly through it every day do not know who he was. Robert Allen Murray Dibb, the green Enon Thatch had pulled into the right hand of his weave at Midway, did not live either. He was killed in a flying accident on the 29th of August, 1944, 2 years and 2 months after his combat debut. He had become an ace himself with 7 aerial victories. He was 23 years old. There is no statue of him anywhere. He is a footnote in most accounts of Midway. But on the morning of the 4th of June, 1942, at the moment when the Thatch was being tested in actual combat for the first time in human history against the most feared fighters in the Pacific, with a hand signal across a cockpit gap and a green pilot's instinct for the right move, he made it work. Saburo Sakai lived a long life. He died on the 22nd of September, 2000 at the age of 84. He had retired from the Imperial Navy at the rank of lieutenant junior grade. He had become a Buddhist who refused to kill any living thing, not even a mosquito. He had become a critic of the war Japan had fought and a vocal opponent of the militarism that had sent his generation into the cockpits of those Zeros. He visited the United States more than once after the war. In 1983, near Los Angeles, an American historian named Henry Sakita arranged a meeting between Sakai and Harold L. Jones, the rear gunner from Bombing 6, whose machine gun bullet had nearly taken his life over Teji 41 years earlier. They exchanged gifts. They shook hands. Sakai produced the bullet-pierced flying helmet he had been wearing on the 7th of August, 1942, still bearing the mark of Jones's marksmanship. 2 old men in a quiet room. Both of them survived something. Neither one had any business surviving. Jimmy Thatch himself went on to a 40-year career. He commanded the escort carrier USS Sicily, hull number CV-118 in the Korean War. He pioneered anti-submarine warfare doctrine in the late 1950s as commander of Task Group Alpha, flying his flag from the carrier USS Valley Forge, work that became the template for how the United States Navy hunted Soviet submarines for the rest of the Cold War. He was promoted to 4-star admiral in 1965. He retired in May of 1967 as Commander-in-Chief United States Naval Forces Europe. He died in Coronado, California on April 15, 1981, 4 days before his 76th birthday, in the same town where he had built the weave on his kitchen table 40 years earlier. When he was asked about it in his oral histories, he tended to deflect the credit to his pilots, especially to O'Hare, who had tested it for him, and to Flatley, who had named it. If your father or grandfather flew in the Pacific War, or worked the carrier flight decks, or served in the air groups that made the long blue ocean campaigns possible, I would be honored to read his story in the comments below. The unit, the carrier, the aircraft, what he saw. Those small specific personal details are the actual record of what happened in those years, and they deserve to be preserved by the people who carry them. So here finally is the answer to the question Sakai's pilots could not stop asking each other in the barracks at Rabble in August of 1942. Who taught the Americans to do that? The answer is a soft-spoken Arkansas named Jimmy Thatch who in the summer before Pearl Harbor read an intelligence bulletin he could not ignore, sat down at his kitchen table with a box of matches, and worked through the geometry of how 2 aircraft could defeat one. He proved it on a wired throttle test against Butch O'Hare in San Diego. He proved it again in actual combat at Midway with a green wingman, a silent radio, and a hand signal. His friends and pupils proved it again at Guadalcanal, at Santa Cruz, at the Philippine Sea. By the end, the men who had set out to be the best individual fighter pilots in the world had been beaten by men who had agreed in advance not to fight alone. If this story gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It helps the next investigation reach the people who care about hearing this kind of history told straight with the names, the dates, and the details intact. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are many of these stories left to tell. Most of them are about ordinary men who looked at a problem the world said could not be solved and sat down at a kitchen table or a workbench with whatever was at hand and solved it anyway. Hey,